Good evening, everybody. Alia Tilsqui to Homework Tisqui to Stalo Nation. We're coming to you from Stalo Nation territory this evening, presenting you with Light the Fire. We have some very dynamic discussion that's going to happen tonight, and we're happy to be bringing this to you on behalf of the Stalo Huhuama government, which is six communities that are coming together for one collective vision. I'm going to be curating the discussion tonight, but first we'd love to open up, as is our traditional Huamukwe, with a prayer. And I'll ask Xwelíqweltel if you could please say the prayer tonight to open us up in a good way.
Okay. Grandfather, good grandmothers, good grandfathers. I ask that you be with us at this time, grandfather, as we have a small meeting with my dear friend, George, Satsan. Grandfather, we give you thanks that he could be with us this evening. We give you thanks also for all those who may be listening and joining us this evening. We ask that you help us in our thoughts and words and our actions, grandfather, that they might be good words, good thoughts, good actions. The whole grandfather. Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you for the prayer. We'd like to welcome you all to the third in a series of online conversations. We really hope that these chats that we've named Light the Fire will allow our community members to understand why we are on the path of self-government. We have the inherent right to self-government and self-determination. This is streaming live onto Facebook and YouTube. So don't hesitate to let your friends and family know and share the link with anyone that might be interested to join us tonight. So as the multimedia coordinator, we came up with this online format of having guests come together and talk about the work of our communities and our leadership. What we have for you guys tonight is very exciting. Satsan and Xwelíqweltel have a long-standing friendship and relationship working as leaders in their respective communities. They've done a lot of amazing work, and they have a lot of long history and perspective into the leadership aspect and Indigenous communities. Just a little bit about Xwelíqweltel. Right now, he is the SXG's lead legal advisor. He's also the Chancellor of the University of British Columbia, currently, and the former Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. Grand Chief Stephen Point practiced law and sat on the provincial court bench for many years. He's also a member of the Xwelíqweltel First Nation and served as chief from 1975 to 1999. From 94 to 99, he served as tribal chair of the Stalo Nation. During that time, the Stalo Nation entered into the BC Treaty process. So we've been at this work for a long time. Satsan is from the Satsan is a Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief of the Frog Clan and a longtime speaker of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. He has over 40 years of experience working towards recognition and respect for the inherent right to self-govern in the courts, classrooms, and communities. Early in his career, Satsan was a key figure and strategist in the Delgamuth Gisdewe decision, which ruled for the first time that Aboriginal title and rights exist in law and are recognized and protected under Section 35. Following that decision, Satsan went on to serve 2 terms as elected regional chief, representing at the BC Assembly of First Nations. He has lent his expertise to build educational programming around Aboriginal and treaty rights and the inherent right to self-government in universities across Canada. There's a lot more that we could say about your illustrious careers, and stuff that you guys have lived and seen firsthand. And I can't wait to get into chatting with you this evening. I'm going to start the panel off with some questions, and then the conversation, I think, is going to organically happen from there. We have around 40 minutes tonight together, and we'd love to leave some time at the end for questions for anybody that's out there listening today on either Facebook or YouTube. The questions can be posted in the Facebook Live or YouTube chat, or emailed to outreach@sxta.bc.ca. So I'm your host at Alia. We have Satsan and Xwelíqweltel. I'd like to start the evening off by asking this question. What does it mean that Indigenous people have the inherent right to self-government? I know it's not a simple one-sentence answer by any means, but I'd love to hear your perspective on what inherent right to self-government means to you.
That's a big question, Herb. You should know that Herb and I went to law school together way back in the early 80s. And Herb went on to do his work for his own nation. And I think he has a very solid grasp on the answer to this question. So I'm going to turn to Herb and ask him what it means to you and to the nation that we have inherent self-government rights.
Thank you very much, Grand Chief Point. We do have a long relationship, one that I treasure, because we met when we were young, and we realized we both had the same vision as far as recognition of our title and rights and our inherent right to self-government, and the importance of stepping up to take on the challenge of achieving that recognition. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate the invitation to be with you around this fire tonight. The inherent right to self-government is very, very personal to me, as it is to all of our people from our respective nations across the country, because there's no doubt that for thousands and thousands of years, we exercise governmental authority and jurisdiction over our sacred homelands and our people. And we know the history of our inherent right to self-government and the origin and content of the Indian Act, which was the stated policy objective of the day was extermination of our people to get us out of the way of settlement, colonization, and ultimately confederation. And that the Indian Act was strategically designed and willfully implemented to do that. And we know that through the history of our inherent right to self-government in Canada as a result of the Indian Act, how that right was seriously diminished, where we, for the most part, lost much of our identity as people. We lost our place on our homelands to exercise our responsibilities and obligations as given by the Creator. Our governance systems were outlawed by the Indian Act. Our lawmaking ability was practically taken away under the Indian Act. In terms of the resources of the people that we needed to govern ourselves, that changed under the Indian Act. And through all that time, our people fought back, and we're the product of that. And the young people tonight joining us are also the product of that. But we have a legacy of resistance across this land, and Grand Chief Point, you and I represent that along with a lot of other people. And we fought back, and the Indian Act ultimately wasn't successful, and we ended up in the courts. We changed the law, and we changed the Constitution. I remember after 1985, with the inclusion of Section 35(1), which recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, the Crown's interpretation of that word existed was that there was no more rights, that they were all extinguished. And our leadership after Section 35, through those constitutional conferences, were trying to get those words added to the definition. And I remember our late great leader, Chief Joe Mathias, was reporting back in Squamish, tears rolling down his face, and he said that we failed. We failed to get those words added. But I always hold up my hands to those great leaders because we didn't fail ultimately. Ultimately, we got those words included through our work in the court. So there's no doubt that Section 35 also includes the inherent right to self-government. And I say that because I wish those great leaders who took us there were able to see that. And so we've achieved the recognition that we've been looking for. And now it's time for us to roll up our sleeves and implement the vision of our great leaders that took us to this place that we talk about right now tonight, because as we speak, we have the inherent right to self-government. And we don't need to negotiate with anybody to put that in place. And we can take back our place on our homelands. And the most important thing to me is we can start to rebuild the health and well-being of our people and our communities and our nations. And most importantly, as far as Canada is concerned, to take back our place as the third order of government, coming in under our own jurisdiction, which is what we've achieved. So the way I look at this is all of the damage that's done by the Indian Act, you know, we live it every day. But we have to take the responsibility to change that. And we have to educate our people to create a consensus decision for change in order to move forward. So that's what it means to me. It's about bettering the lives of our people.
I would only add this to what you've said, Herb, and I really, really appreciate your insight and the way that you framed this discussion, because too often I think some leaders tend to look through the lens of government to find our rights or to find our place in Canada. You've done the opposite. You've looked through the lens of your own self-government and said that we don't need to have a treaty or we don't need to have a negotiated agreement to have self-government and to exercise self-government. It simply is there. And the only thing I would add is that something I found out later on, studying and reading factums as they went up to the Supreme Court when we were engaged. The word inherent in this sentence means that our rights do not derive from Canadian law. Inherent means that they existed prior to the arrival of the Europeans. And it's kind of like that word sui generis that gets bandied about sometimes, although people don't quite understand it. Arose in the Calder case. And it was Boralaska, I think, in the Calder case that coined the phrase sui generis, meaning that for a long time, people had been arguing that the Royal Proclamation was the Charter of Indigenous Rights, and it was the source of Indigenous rights. And he put to bed that whole argument, the need for recognition by government or legislation to have Indigenous rights to self-government recognized. And so that word inherent means that it pre-exists prior to the arrival of the Europeans. It does not derive from Canadian law. And that's important. That's an important underlying distinction that we now make in discussions around Indigenous rights and the right to self-government. I was going to ask you, because it occurred to me as you were talking that, you know, in the midst of all the struggles that you and I have been either part of, or at least we witnessed happening, the United Nations now has passed this UNDRIP, what they call it, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it specifically, as I understand it, makes it clear that Indigenous people have these rights. And now the provincial government has passed legislation, as of the federal government, to make it part of domestic law. What do you think of that development?
I think, first of all, I want to just comment on very, very important that you made regarding that word inherent. Because when we went into the courts on Delgamuukw and Gisdaywa at the Supreme Court level of British Columbia, as you know, our case was based on our oral histories, the evidence that we put forward, and our case was brought forward in our respective language, the Wet'suwet'en language and the Gitxsan language. And the first argument that we made in the court was that, first of all, Aboriginal title and rights comes from our own law. And at the BC Supreme Court, then Chief Justice McEachran ruled that we weren't sufficiently civilized to have our own law, to have laws. At best, they were customs, right?
Yep.
But by the time we got to the Supreme Court of Canada, the court recognized that, in fact, yes, we do have our laws, and that, first of all, our title arises from our laws. And you look through the progression of cases, Haida, for example, where the Supreme Court came right out and said that the promise of Section 35 is reconciliation. And the reconciliation is between the pre-existent sovereignty of First Nations and the assumed sovereignty of the Crown.
Absolutely.
And then you go further into Chilcotin. There's no doubt that our inherent right comes from the Creator, comes from our own law, from our own sovereignty, our own jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And we have to put government in a place to recognize that. And I think that's very, very important, because when we teach our people in a community, which I do, this notion that we had the inherent right to self-government, pre-existent sovereignty, and that it survived Confederation and is now recognized and affirmed under Section 35 of the Constitution Act is very, very important.
Yeah.
And recently there was a decision out of the Quebec Court of Appeal on Bill C-92, the children and family legislation. The Quebec Court of Appeal said to the Crown, you've got to stop behaving as if you're giving something to First Nations. You aren't. They've always had it. They have the inherent right to self-government under Section 35. Otherwise, Section 35 is meaningless.
Yeah.
So that's a very, very important point. Now, with respect to UNDRIP, I think one of the things that it took a long time to achieve that. And I was watching Wilton Littlechild when at a visit with the Pope, talking about the fact that it was the longest negotiation in United Nations history just to be able to achieve recognition that we are a people, that Indigenous people are a people. That's amazing.
It is, yeah.
And then ultimately we got UNDRIP, and Canada, we know, along with other British Empire countries, opposed it.
United States.
Now we have it.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing that we need to teach our people is that we've achieved this recognition.
Mhm.
But the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is not enforceable here. In other words, even if the Crown doesn't pass legislation, the UN can't enforce it. So, you know, we're seeing legislation come forward, but if it's not making any change to the status quo, then how strong is it? So we have to be vigilant about that.
Yes.
And I think that if you look at what we've achieved in recognition in terms of the law and the Constitution, that's enforceable. So, but I think that it gives us really great leverage. And I think when we're looking at that new relationship with the Crown, that the principles and the language is very, very useful.
It's interesting. And we're just negotiating our treaty. We've been negotiating now for 27 years. I was the one that brought us in as the Stalo Nation into the treaty process. I remember walking into the summit meeting, and the first time I walked into a summit meeting, I'd never been to a summit meeting before. And Joe Mathias got up, he walked over to me and gave me a hug. And I said, well, I'm here now. I'm here for self-government. That's what I wanted to do. And so we've been negotiating on the George Manuel premise, when I worked with George, that we're not extinguishing our rights. We want to manage our rights through self-government. And that self-government is an inherent right that can't be defined by anybody but us. We're the only ones that can define it.
Right.
And one of the things that we've said, Herb, and I was just working on the preamble this morning. 3 things. One is that we were here first. You know, it wasn't the Chinese, it wasn't the Japanese, it wasn't anyone from Europe. It was indigenous people. We were here before when the Europeans arrived, and that's an incredible statement for us to make, that we were here when Europeans arrived, and that we had our own self-government, we had our own laws. And I've made that as a preamble statement in our treaty negotiations. The other thing I said was that even though the Royal Proclamation, which ended the European conflict between France and England and the United States, that said that the Royal Proclamation applies to us insofar as the doctrine of consent is embodied in that document. And that's the only part of the document that I'm interested in, of course, is the doctrine of consent, that they can't have our land unless we agree to it, right? In other words, the Royal Proclamation recognized that was our land. That's
right.
The main issue there. And the other thing I've indicated in our preamble is that we have sovereignty. We have sovereignty like any other nation in the world, that our relationship, however, with Canada right now is as a protectorate. They have an obligation to protect our sovereignty. And that's the basis upon which we're entering into negotiations, is that we're a sovereign nation living under the protection of Canada. And so far, the federal government hasn't said boo about it. They haven't said anything. And of course, we've written into the treaty that UNDRIP applies to these, to us. And again, Canada has not said anything about that. So I guess it's a wait and see how this is going to progress through the negotiations. I firmly believe that as you said, that we don't need a treaty to wield our Aboriginal right to self-government or to exercise those rights. I see a lot of First Nations actually now out in the land, Some of them are building longhouses out of their territory, or they're building homes out of the territory, out of their own logs and whatnot, as an assertion of their rights. And how do you, what do you think of that model, the assertion model?
Well, it's interesting, you know, like, first of all, the source of our right, our title and rights is the fact that we were here first, occupying, using, and protecting our lands.
Mhm.
And that right has been recognized as a sovereign right.
Mhm.
And of course, the Royal Proclamation was actually the first recognition. And we actually argued that in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
As part of our argument that the Royal Proclamation was the first recognition of Aboriginal title. But on the other hand, the Royal Proclamation also asserted jurisdictional control and authority over us and our lands. So the double-edged sword there. But we got the recognition that we were looking for there, and we have the sovereignty. And the way I look at treaties, and I think that we need to be really serious about this. We don't have to negotiate our rights to the land and our right to self-government.
Mhm.
But what I think the treaty should serve is to define our jurisdictional relationship
Exactly.
with the Crown as a third order of government.
Yeah. Government to government.
How is our sovereignty going to interact with theirs? The assumed sovereignty, as the Supreme Court said.
Yeah. Reconciliation.
And if you look into the law and the Constitution, there's a procedure, a legal and constitutional procedure to drive negotiations towards reconciliation.
Mhm.
And as long as we wait for the Crown to do it, that's not going to happen.
No.
We have to take the initiative and pick up the torch, because unfortunately, the way the law has developed around consultation and accommodation, which is the procedure,
Mhm.
is that it's an interim measure coming out of HIDA.
Yeah.
So that means that in order to trigger it, we have to challenge. And it's triggered when the court said it's triggered when the Crown has knowledge that what it's intended to do is going to have an adverse impact on the title and rights of us as a people.
Yeah.
And as long as they don't know, then there is no obligation.
Mhm.
So the court also said it's incumbent on First Nations to say so with clarity. So we got to get our case together, and we have to challenge. And it's clear that the procedure that's in place there, the reconciliation, and we need to move out from Section 9124 of the Indian Act, because the way it's set out is unless and until we do move out from Section 9124 of the Indian Act, under Section 35 with our own inherent rights, governance, our own jurisdiction, and our own laws, that unless and until we do that, that procedure doesn't exist. In other words, as long as we don't move there, there is no jurisdiction to reconcile. So
This has been
we
a
don't
great-
have to be waiting to do that.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time that we do it, we need to be thinking about what that jurisdictional relationship is going to be.
You're meaning 9124 of the BNE Act, right? Here's North America Act.
The Indian Act.
Getting us out of the Indian Act, right?
Right.
Yeah. And this is exactly the dialogue that we're having now at the summit common table. We're arguing that the government doesn't have any title to our land. So they have nothing to give us.
Right.
Therefore,
Exactly.
we're not interested in receiving the land because that's a British title. The only thing we're interested in is having the federal government remove its title and the provincial government to remove its title because it has no title to give us. Therefore, just leaving Indian title, which is protected by Section 35, and therefore we're comfortable with it moving out from it under 9124. But until then, we're not going to move it out of 9124 because otherwise we plink down to provincial jurisdiction, which means taxation. And we're saying, no, we don't want to go that route. But you're right, it's a move into section 35. How do we maneuver ourselves so that we end up with a protected right under as a sovereign nation, which is protected by section 35 only. That's all we need.
Yeah, and that recognition
Mhm.
is there. You know, that was what we also achieved with the Algamuk and Gistewe, is the first definition in terms of section 35
Mhm.
recognizing Aboriginal title and rights,
Mhm.
not only recognizing it, but also protecting it against extinguishment, that
Yes.
the Crown can't unilaterally extinguish. And so, you know, the Indian Act is something that I think it's the most important thing that we have to educate our people about.
Mhm.
I do this work across the country. I've been into, you know, a little over maybe 300 communities across this land.
Mhm.
And I always ask the people when I go there, who's read the Indian Act? And the most hands I've seen go up is 6.5.
Yeah.
One kind of like this, I read a bit of it. And you know, what's important there is the Indian Act regulates every aspect of our lives from the time that we're born to the time that we die.
Yes.
And our people don't even know it.
No, no.
And when we teach them, they're shocked that it was strategically and willfully done to them. Residential school was part of a bigger plan.
Mhm.
And it's shocking to them when they learn that as we speak, that status card stands for the fact that we are born wards of the Crown. And secondly, the thing that shocks our people is that we also are born without full legal status and capacity as a natural person, which every other Canadian is born with.
Yes.
And then they're also shocked that the house that they live on, the land that it's on, does not belong to us under the Indian Act. And then the most shocking thing to them, to our people, is when we teach them about fiscal relations and the fiscal transfer for essential services for the Canadian public is constitutionally guaranteed under Section 36, which was added also in 1982. And it guarantees an equal level of services for all Canadians across the country. And in our research with this National Center of First Nations Governance and now the Center for First Nations Governance, we know that the fiscal transfer for Indians on the reserve for essential services is up to 45% less than the Canadian public is used to.
Yeah.
So when you think about that and you combine it with the notion that we don't have full legal status and capacity as a people, and nor do the band councils, I question our citizenship in Canada. And as long as we stay under the Indian Act, that's what we are. So that, and when we teach our people,
yeah,
what I've learned is that we need to bring in medicine people and spiritual people to help, because inevitably there are breakdowns.
Mhm.
But what comes out of it, this hard teaching, is a consensus decision for change.
Yes.
People say we can't sentence another generation to die under the Indian Act.
Mhm.
And so we have to get that decision for change. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve anything. And it's through education, educating our people. That means we got to be talking to them,
Mhm.
because they are the rights holders when we talk about the inherent right.
There's one other misconception that came out when the Nisga's signed their agreement. My nephew happened to be a member of one of the Nisga'a First Nations, and his mother signed them out of the Nisga'a Nation to join her nation, which is somewhere in the interior of British Columbia. I can't remember. And I asked him why. He said, to preserve our rights as natives under the Indian Act. I said, what? What rights do we have protected under the Indian Act? And there's this huge misconception that we have somehow preserved rights under the Indian Act.
Well-
And this is, there's this great fear that we're going to lose our rights under the Indian Act if we go towards self-government. I go, my God, we don't have any rights protected by the Indian Act.
Yeah, that's why this education is so important, because our people, the babies being born today are the 8th generation under the Indian Act. 8 generations of that severe oppression,
Mhm.
and our people have been just living the sustenance lifestyle, just enough to live, and struggling with all of the trauma associated with it. And they mistakenly believe that there are rights associated with it and that we're going to lose something. But when we educate them, our people realize, I didn't know that before. I've seen, when I've done this in communities where elders have gotten up and hugged one another, people shaking hands because for the first time they realized all this conflict is a result of the Indian Act, not of our own doing, And then the fear, right? And this is why it's important to teach our people about fiscal relations in terms of governance.
Mhm.
So we're seeing it happen with Bill C-92 on children and family, the first legislative recognition of our inherent right to self-government. But more importantly, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal recognized that Canada discriminates against our children by not providing the same level of services and resources
Mhm.
as the Canadian public is used to.
Yeah.
And so we're having this equalization starting to take place. And so when people are afraid, we got to teach them how little we have under the Indian Act and how powerless we are there,
Mhm.
and how much we stand to gain just simply by equalizing the fiscal transfer.
Yeah.
For essential services, we can double the amount of money is coming into our communities right now.
Yes. Well, I've heard estimates of 5 times more, and talking to people who are engaged in fiscal discussions now, say that the communities are engaged in the new fiscal policies stand to gain 5 times. So moving out of the Indian Act and into self-government, it's got an awful lot to say for it from a fiscal perspective, that's for sure. I don't know how we're doing on time, Herb. I was going to tell you that
We're doing good.
that when I worked for immigration, I found out that there's a section in the Immigration Act. I don't know if it's still there, but was when I was there, because I worked for immigration during my law school years, and then I became an adjudicator a few years later in the early 90s. But at that time, it said that status Indians have the same right to enter and go Canada as if they were a citizen. The implication being that we're not citizens, right?
Yeah.
Where we, and if you look at the Jay Treaty, which goes back to 1812, it also states that Indigenous people, regardless of, the conflict that's happened here between Canada and the United States, they're still allowed to go back and forth over the border. That was because they weren't impacted by this treaty, right? And so your question is pretty good. The question is whether or not, in fact, all these years, the assumed sovereignty of Canada, the assumed sovereignty of the land, did they assume sovereignty? And do they really not have sovereignty over Indigenous people? That's a good question.
Well, if you look look at the decision coming out on Chilcotin. When the court made that declaration of Chilcotin title on the land,
Mhm.
one of the questions that it also had to ask then was, okay, so this is Chilcotin title lands.
Mhm.
Can the Crown regulate Aboriginal title lands under its legislation? And the court said, well, it can, but the legislation has to say so specifically. And we know that it doesn't, because it's been an outright denial since the time of Confederation.
Yeah.
So the next question was, can the Crown amend its legislation to regulate Aboriginal title lands? And the court says, yes, generally speaking, they can. However, they have to do so in light of Section 35 and the honor of the Crown. And the court determines they can't. So the next question the court asked in Chilcotin was whether or not the BC Forest Act continues to apply to Chilcotin Aboriginal title lands.
Mhm.
So, you know, when an act is called into question, they go through this statutory interpretation.
Yeah.
The pith and substance of the Forest Act is to manage Crown timber.
Yes.
So the Supreme Court looks at the Chilcotin title lands and says that's no longer Crown timber, that's Chilcotin timber. So what happened is British Columbia legislation, the Forest Act, failed. In other words, they had no jurisdiction.
Over Indian title, of course. Yeah.
And that's the power of our pre-existing sovereignty and our inherent right to self-government.
Well, that's been the case since St. Catharines Millings, though, Herb. St. Catharines Millings said specifically, and this is an old Privy Council case, goes right back to 18 something. And it said that the provincial government could not treat the forest lands as a source of revenue until Indian title was extinguished. So they don't have jurisdiction of the forest, not since the Privy Council case, which is common law in Canada. And that's interpreting the existence of Indian title. And if Indian title in British Columbia has never been extinguished, which every Supreme Court of Canada case has so far said.
And it's interesting with St. Catharines.
They have no jurisdiction over forests in BC, you know?
So it's up to us to put ourselves in that position.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
And unless and until we do, then we're going to sit here on the reserve under the Indian Act.
Yeah. Thinking that we're protecting our rights.
and it's going to continue to kill our people, which it was designed to do.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. You know, in our nation rebuilding project across the country, part of the work we're doing is the systems analysis of the Indian Act, systems map in the Indian Act. What was it designed to do? How was it designed? And what did it do? What were the consequences and so on? And one of the people working with us is from the University of Portland, a systems specialist. And he said two things. Number one, he was shocked that the language in the early colonial legislation was the stated policy objective was extermination.
Yes.
And later, the advertised objective became assimilation. And then he asked me a question. He said, Satsan, when I do this kind of work, one of the questions I need to answer is this. What is the mechanism that allows the Indian Act to do what it does? And I had to admit I didn't know because I never thought about it. But I said I would think about it. And I came back the next day and I said, I have the answer. The mechanism which allowed the Indian Act to do what it does is the rest of the Constitution itself, because it has effectively excluded us. And I remember when we were arguing at the Supreme Court of Canada, that was a part of our argument. Why is it that this Canadian Constitution, the highest law of the land, is there to protect the Canadian public, and Indigenous people, First Nations people, have to fight their way into it? And that's still where we are.
Yeah, we're on the outside looking in, essentially.
So when we put ourselves there under Section 35 as a third order of government, then it's legally and constitutionally enforceable that the Crown has to recognize us like that and deal with us like that.
Yeah. I think
So,
that's the power of the treaty process, as long as we do it from a sovereignty perspective.
well, I was involved, like you were, to create the treaty process.
Mhm.
But what has happened is that we know our vision is still the same,
Yeah,
but the mandates haven't changed on the part of Canada and British Columbia. And that's what we need to see.
yes,
They got to get off this notion that they got land to give us
yes.
and they got governmental authority to give us. They don't.
No, we start from a whole different perspective on that. But you're right, we haven't changed their mandates very much. That's the problem.
I think that's the problem with the process.
Mhm.
Because going back, our original vision was that we have the right.
Yeah.
The treaty is a treaty between nations.
Yes,
This is the relationship that we're going to have with respect to our sovereignties.
Mhm.
And we've done that research as well. Like that how Section 91 and 92 works, which is the jurisdiction of Canada and the provinces,
Mhm.
the notion of paramountcy, the notion of exclusive jurisdiction, concurrent jurisdiction. We've done the research on that to see, can First Nations jurisdiction under Section 35 operate within this jurisdictional sphere that's there?
Yes,
And there's no doubt that it can.
yeah.
Well,
there's no doubt that nations have shared sovereignty. This notion of shared sovereignty is not a stranger to international law.
mm-hmm.
And both two nations occupying the same sovereign space at one time. I think in constitutional law we were taught that's not possible. Two sovereign nations can't be in the same space. But truth is, internationally they have done it. The Treaty of Oregon is an example of that. For 10 years, the United States and Britain shared the sovereignty over the Oregon Territory while the dispute was being resolved over the boundary. And so it is possible, and that's the approach that what I'd like to take with ours is that I don't care if the federal or provincial government agree with me that I'm a sovereign nation living under the protection of Canada. That's how I'm negotiating. Where the rubber hits the road is how these two nations are going to deal with forestry. How are we going to deal with children? How are we going to deal with justice from a sovereign nation perspective who is living under the protection of Canada and protected by Section 35? Now we just talk about how we're going to work together. I want a piece of the pie every time a tree is cut in our territory, regardless of whether it's on lands that we resume under the treaty or not.
And that's the thing right there, Stephen, is that they want us to work together with them under their legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And the reconciliation is between our respective laws. They have no law to give us.
No.
And I think the point you make about international law is very, very important, because that's about conflict of laws between nations, right?
Yes.
And I think that the principles that are attached to it are important principles that we can use when we put our laws in place.
Mm-hmm.
And when that conflict arises and there needs to be reconciliation, I mean, the Supreme Court has given guidance there, says that it might mean that the Crown has to amend or change its policies, to amend or change its regulations, or to amend or change its laws. So we are in a very, very powerful position, and
Yeah,
we need to teach our people, because I always just bothers me that here we are, after over 150 years of work since Confederation, achieving the recognition that we've been fighting for.
yeah,
And then still sitting on the
nickels and
reserve
dimes. Yeah,
under
yeah,
the Indian Act and
yeah,
taking that little handout and
yeah.
powerless.
Fighting over it too. Yeah,
And meanwhile, we have our pre-existing sovereignty waiting there, so that
exactly.
we can, the way I look at it is we can take that, our robe of power and put it on.
Yeah, exactly.
That was
That's a good point, because we have a robe actually in our treaty.
we are in a very, very
our woolen
powerful
blanket
position,
that represents our sovereignty.
and
Yeah.
we need to teach our people, because I always just Yeah.
Teresa, I'm just wondering, can I ask you a question about the Institute? When did it start, and what work is it doing now?
Oh, the Center for First Nation Governance?
Yes.
Well, we had the National Center on First Nations Governance, and you remember Attawapiskat was happening, right?
Yes.
In Northern Ontario, and the communities called me to come in to help, and I went there to meet with them at Thunder Bay to talk about putting together a strategy to address it.
Mhm.
And the following week, actually the following Tuesday, the deputy minister called me up and said, "That's the end of your center."
You're
Because
kidding.
yeah. So anyway, so they yanked the funding, even though we had negotiated it directly from Treasury Board. So I took a little bit of time off, and I rebuilt the Center for First Nations Governance without any funding at all.
Oh,
And I put together a national research project through partnerships with universities across the country. So we've achieved a 6-year of funding of applied research to assist First Nations in rebuilding their own governments. And the idea there is to go into the community, and we use this frame of reference, what we call the 5 pillars of the inherent right, as our working place, the framework. And it's about the people, it's about our sacred homelands, it's about our jurisdiction and our laws, our governance systems, and resources, both the human resource and the natural resources that we need to govern and look after our people. So we teach them prior to Confederation, they go through a process to self-define it. And then we take them into Confederation and show them the history of our inherent right to self-government in Canada, how we lost it, and how we regained it through our legacy of resistance in the courts and the Constitution, and we've got it back. So now the question is, what do we do?
Mhm.
So we take them through a process of visioning, so that you create this common vision coming from the people, where
Okay.
they also establish the priorities,
Mhm.
strategic direction, and the mandate comes from that. So that's where this research project kicks in. The research need that emerges from the people. So for example, water is important to our people,
Yeah.
and fisheries. So there are some nations who want to start with fisheries. So one of the things that we do with the research project is, okay, we've been without our laws for a long time. So what do we need to do to put them back in place? And then when we go to our people, the first thing they say is it has to come from our creation stories, our oral histories, and it's embedded in our language, our customs, traditions, ceremonies, all of that.
Yes.
So what do we need to do to pull them back up and breathe life into it? So the research project does that part of the work. And similarly with children and family or education, we're doing work with Anishinaabe Nation on health jurisdiction.
Yeah,
And so we have this project going, and Stolo Nation was a part of it when we began it, and kind of, we just lost connection there. And it's there to, I put it out, and here it's there if you want to take advantage of it, because the idea is to connect nations working together across the country to create a nation rebuilding action network. Instead of going to political meetings and making speeches, we're going to get together and learn how to work.
That's actually really refreshing to hear, because from my perspective as I wouldn't say I'm a youth anymore, a young person, but as somebody coming up in the community and watching Grand Chief Stephen Point do this work all his life, one of the really, I think, frustrating aspects has been you guys speak at a high level with terms that you understand as lawyers and education that you've acquired because of your interest in self-governance and moving the vision for our people forward. But the average person listening, the average community member might say, I don't know what legislation is. I don't know what Section 35 is. I don't know what this means. When you're talking about sovereignty and things like that, right? The average person is sort of lost.
Mm-hmm.
And that education piece, I think that translation from, hey, we're trying to steer you in a really positive direction based on what we know, what we've seen, what we've made our best assessment on the situation, and having people trust in Indigenous leadership. There's a real lack of trust there in our community members. A, they don't trust the government. B, they don't trust their own leadership and band councils, chief and council, and then C, they're kind of coming up with their own ideas, and oftentimes it's almost like conspiracy around some of these things moving forward. So I wanted to ask, to start off the section part of the discussion, we have some questions from people that are online listening. But I wanted to ask, in terms of the education piece, it's really, really refreshing to hear you say, Satsan, that this national network work has started. Because one of my frustrations has been that we have all these micronations across Canada. And if I live in Xwelíqweltel and I receive benefits from living on Xwelíqweltel, this tiny little 160 square hectares, but I move away, all of a sudden I'm disconnected from my community. Or if we become tribal affiliation, we get benefits under being Xwelíqweltel, but I marry somebody from a different tribe, all of a sudden my grandchildren are now blood quantumed out. There's no connection between all these micronations across Canada, never mind the United States. And the network that I hear you talking about is actually really inspiring, refreshing to hear about that. But how do you keep going and working for your vision, and you keep on getting the same questions and the same sort of rhetoric from people over and over and over again? I cannot imagine how that must feel as a leader, and how you keep yourself going through all of that, because I find it to be tiring, and I've basically been a bystander and I've been an observer.
Well, the point you're making there is exactly the challenge that we have to meet. And that is that our people under the Indian Act don't trust anybody. Yeah, and if we're going to do something with their right, the first way to gain that trust is for the people to understand and see that the leadership interestingly elected under the Indian Act, is saying to the people, this right belongs to you. It cannot be held by the Band Council under the Indian Act because it doesn't have any rights to hold, even though the Crown prefers to deal with them. So that's the one thing in common with the nations I work with across the country on the rebuilding First Nations governance, is that they've got leadership who have made that decision and turn it over to the people. So now we got to engage the people. And we don't know how. We forgot how under the Indian Act. So through our center, through our work on the ground, we've learned a thing or two over the last 20 plus years doing this. And I realized it's about educating the people. So Stephen and I are having this conversation because, you know, we're both trained that way. But when I go to the community, I'm a whole different person. You know, my work on Delgamuukw and Gisdewe was working with our communities and our people. So I had to come out there with a plain language approach. So when I go to the communities, it's a whole different approach. And we teach the people. And at some point in that interaction with the people, they start to realize, holy, it's no longer just Indian Act BS that we're used to. They're actually talking to us. And this sense of empowerment starts to emerge from people. And this trust starts to build and legitimacy. And the medicine that makes that happen is hope. Hope for the future of our children. And so I take really great pride in my work in the communities. We did this session with Anishinaabe Nation in Northern Ontario via Zoom, 49 communities, 7 tribal councils, 3 languages. And at one point, as elders spoke up and he said, Satsan, as elders, we totally understand what you're talking about. You're talking our language. We understand it. The problem is the damage that's been done to the younger generations. And we need to address it. And the other thing the elder said was, when we need to hook up with your young people like yourself, because you're going to be that next generation that take it the next step. So the point you're making is the most important thing here, and that is, we're talking about the right that belongs to the people, collectively and communally. And if we're going to do something with it, then that vision needs to come from the people. The priorities need to be established by them. The strategic direction needs to come, and a clear mandate. And from my experience doing this, when you get to that place, people take off their Indian Act hat. And it's quite dynamic and amazing to observe and be a part of. And then they put on their inherent right blanket, their robe of power. And then they start talking about, okay, now this is what we need to do together. You know? So that's what we need to do. The challenge is to get on the ground amongst our people and educate them according to our principles and values within our own systems, and learn how to treat one another with recognition and respect again. Because it can happen. I know it. I've done it. You know, and it's all it is getting to the people and building the trust, like you say, and the legitimacy. And the only way that that's going to come about is to hand it back to them, to empower them.
That's amazing.
And young
like
people, you know, the elders have said our young people are crucial to this. So in our nation rebuilding project with participating nations, what we're doing there is training young people to be organizers and facilitators, to do it, and hooking them up with the elders. And so what we're looking to do is to create inherent rights training centers in each of the nations that we work with, so that we can begin to train a new generation of inherent rights leaders. You don't need to be trained to get elected under the Indian Act. All you got to be is popular. But under our inherent right, we know in our histories that our leaders were trained. And we have to do that again. You know, I'll give you an example. And we just finished the session with Stand in Buffalo in Saskatchewan last week. And at the end of the first day, I couldn't stop smiling. And my wife noticed it, because usually I'm a pretty serious person. And she said, "You look like you're having a really good day." And I said, "I am, because I've got these 3 young ladies working with me on this. And I realized this morning that they can do this, you know?" So the next day, at the end of it, I asked them to stay on Zoom with me. And I thanked them for giving me that great gift. And I said, "I've been waiting a long time for this. And you 3, in this work that we've been doing, you can do it." And one of the young ladies is an Anishinaabe from Ontario. And she said, "That's what I was thinking, Satsan, when we were doing the first part of the 5 pillars on the inherent right prior to contact. I can do that." And I got a young Mohawk young lady working with me, who's been with me now for a couple of years. And she said, "I was thinking the same thing, Satsan. I could do that training on the Indian Act, the origin and content." And the other young lady, who's from Vancouver Island, was doing the facilitation for me. And she said, "I know I can do this, Satsan." So we got to train our young people to be that next generation. Steve and I are getting old.
Tell me about it.
That's why I was so excited to come and do this with you, Stephen. But to meet the young people this morning, that was even more exciting, because I realized, wow, that's the kind of young people we need.
Amen.
You know?
Amen.
So
That's very cool. And I feel like that also answered part of what you said, answered one of the questions we had from Karen Goodfellow, who posed, "How prepared are we?" And this question I've heard lots and lots. This question has come up, but you know, we face it again. How prepared are we to be self-governed? i.e., is there an Indigenous capacity building structure in place? And I feel like you just answered that. You know, that's something that we need to get linked back into in the Stalo Nation, is this inherent right to self-government training. And that's something that we as an outreach team, and hopefully with the blessing of our leadership, can get involved with, because that's exactly what we do need, is reframing the discussion around the fact that we've never given up our Aboriginal rights and title. We have the inherent right to self-government, and that there's a whole different angle to these negotiations now and treaty. I feel like if there was ever time to negotiate a treaty, it's now, because we have so many things in place that we never had before. We have tools and leaders and education and people in place that we never ever had before. And I think if any, there was a time that this is the time that we need to step forward. But, you know, the question stands, and I think that's represents a good amount of our people. How prepared are we to be self-governed?
Well, you know, I run into that question all the time. And no one's done this before. You know, this rebuilding our nations based on our inherent right to self-government. And if we're going to wait around for the right time that we know this is the time to go, we're not going to do a damn thing. You know, we have to realize that we have the right and we need to come together and start working together and just begin. And the challenges will emerge because there are a lot of challenges. Capacity is one of them. We'll meet that right away. But we'll meet it from a different frame of mind, a different mental model. It won't be the impossible, it'll be about the possible. And we always say we don't have capacity. Yes, we do. We just need to reprofile the resources and move some of those people out of the ban office and put them into your own government house to work with the people. I work with this one community, for example, where they've made that decision. And there was fear that, well, we got 10 people working in lands. And if we do this, we're going to lose 7. And I said, well, where do you think they're going to go? You know, you're not losing them. What you are doing is you're gaining inherent right capacity, because those 7 people are going to pack up their desks in the ban office under the Indian Act, and they're going to put it into their cardboard boxes, and they're going to walk out of that Indian Act building, and they're going to walk into your own government house and set up your title and rights department. So you're not losing people, right? So, and that's just a mental thing. So when you think about it, like one of the things that we do is the ban office and the ban council is the status quo. The people who are there are not the problem, it's the system. So let's get so good at it that we're only putting, say, 20 to 30% effective, efficient time to fulfilling the roles and responsibilities under the Indian Act. And let's break out the rest of that time and resources to work with our people. That strategy emerges from the people themselves. They say, you know, we got to deal with the ban office. That's not going to go away like overnight. That's going to be there for some time still. But let's stop wasting 100% of our time there. Because a lot of the time that we spend is reactionary. We just react.
Yeah.
So there's no time. There's no time to, the right time to start is now. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Well, we were inherently self-governing before Europeans came for thousands of years. And I think we can pick the ball up and go again. Hey, Herb. You don't need a university education to take care of the land. You just need a desire to make sure it's done well.
Everywhere across the country, the people, when it comes to our sacred homeland, say the same thing.
Yeah.
We need to take our place back out there so that we can continue to fulfill our responsibilities and obligations. Right? When we were doing Delgamuukw and Gisdewe, I remember, I think it was Jeff Plant, who was a council for the province, turned to Gisdewe in dismay. He was saying, are you saying to me that your people manage the lands? And Gisdewe turned to him and said in a very quiet voice, no, I didn't say that. We're just human beings. We can't manage the lands, but we can manage our conduct. That's what I'm talking about. That's a very different thing, right? So that's what our elders, our leaders were fighting for. And we can do that now. You know, Stephen, the point you were making in your opening comments about we need to get back out on our land is a part of that. You know, we can go there. we have that recognition.
So with the idea of a treaty, just some final thoughts to wrap up the discussion. We went a little bit over time because the conversation is so engaging, and I think, we could really sit like this and talk about all of your knowledge for hours. But we did only slot in a certain amount of time. We definitely hope to have you back, Satsan, and have you in our community to share some of your perspective, because you have that lived experience in your own community doing these things to bring to our people. But just some closing thoughts and maybe some final things around treaty. And one of the biggest misconceptions is that we're selling our land. That the essence of treaty is that we are giving up something that is ours. And so we have, what do we stand to lose, is the perspective that people come from, right? And that somehow we're selling out, we're giving away land, we're giving away all this territory is ours, and really, that is the biggest argument I've always heard in the community, being on the ground and having connections in the community, is that it's like, well, you're selling out, you're turning your back on us, and you're giving away all this territory that actually doesn't have a claim on it. So why would we ever sign a treaty? And what has been, I guess, your saving grace, or the thing that keeps you moving forward when there's so much misconception out there in our communities that somehow we are doing a disservice to our people by signing on to a treaty? And I know that you covered this, and I know that's how the conversation started. You're not explaining this to me, but for the people that are listening and that are online with us tonight, how do you respond to that? That's a really, really tough question.
It is a tough question. But again, it's a comment, it's a point that Stephen made earlier. And that is when we put Section 35 into the Constitution, our great leaders did that. And I'm always thankful, because it doesn't exist in any other country in the world where Indigenous people have that in the Constitution. So we got that put in there, and it went from an empty box of rights to a full box of rights. And the only people who can define the content of that full box of rights are the people who hold it. Nobody else can do it for you but you, and for me, right? So when we define that full box of rights, which is our inherent right to self-government, and then we look to implement it, then these questions are going to come up. And now you can address them and answer them from a position of power, governmental authority, jurisdiction, sovereignty. Whereas on the other side of it, the cost of doing nothing is our people continue to die under the Indian Act. So I think that if we get people involved and engaged in defining their own right and then implementing it, these kind of things will fall by the wayside, because people will know from their own learning and experience that there's nothing to be afraid of, that ultimately it's the treaty, in my opinion. It's not about them giving us anything. It's not about us giving away anything either.
Yeah.
We have it.
Yeah,
It's about what is our relationship going to be.
exactly.
You look at the children, Bill C-92, the children and family legislation. First recognition of our inherent right to self-government, including jurisdiction over our children and family, under Section 35. It talks about engaging the rights holders, the people, to put in place the legislation, our own laws, and then to put in place the authorized governing body. It doesn't make no mention of the Indian Act or the Band Council, our inherent rights governing body. And when we've accomplished that, we then turn to the Crown, British Columbia and Canada, and say, all right, we have our law in place, we have our own governing body in place, and we're giving you notice that we're going to assume our own jurisdiction over our children and family. So the Crown has 1 year to respond. And the language in the legislation is the coordination agreement. And the way I read it, it's like the reconciliation that came out of the Haida decision. It's a reconciliation, it's a coordination between our laws and their laws. That's what the treaty should ultimately be about. And when you really look at it like that, then it alleviates this misconception or this fear that somehow we're giving up something. Because, when we achieve the recognition and protection of our title and rights under Section 35 and Delgamuukw and Gisteway, that gave me great comfort, because I thought, as long as we don't do anything stupid, like give it up and extinguish it, it'll always be there. And even though it might take us 3 or 4 or even 7 generations to accomplish this, our title and rights will still be there, because it's not about extinguishment. It's about a new relationship with the Crown, government to government to government. But the operative thing is education, because our people have been left out of this dialogue. I mean, there's a roar, and like, I don't hear our leaders talking about this anymore. Yet we fought so hard for it. We've got to bring this conversation back. And I think the other thing is, we need to breathe life into the vision that was set there for us by our great leaders of the past, because that vision still applies right now as we speak. We're still trying to do the same thing.
And somehow it does get lost in translation, I think, at points in time because of this Band Council shift, because we're under the Indian Act rules of how Band Council should operate, and that they have the say actually over any time we want to make any little change in the Band Council, or a little chunk of land. As you said, we don't own the land that we live on. Ultimately, it's Crown land, and people talk about all the land that we're giving up. Well, we've lived on this tiny little reserve all my life. I don't see us giving up anything. I see all the land that we have to gain and claim our stake on, what we can save for the future generations. So, my perspective is one thing, growing up, learning and knowing all of these things, but the education piece that you bring up is hugely important. And it's something we struggle with as an outreach team, as an organization, to get people to come, to engage, to listen. But I think we've done that tonight. If a few people tuned in tonight that normally wouldn't come and listen to a talk like this, then we've done our good work, our due diligence to keep trying, keep working at it. And I've really, really enjoyed listening to you. Like I said, I could sit and talk with you guys for hours and just soaking up the knowledge. But I hope to continue the connection to the work that you're doing, that we as an outreach team and as a Stall local Quilmot government, we're acting and working as a government now. We've taken that on. We're not waiting for anybody to tell us, and that's by the guidance of our leadership. the perseverance of the leaders that have been working on the land question for many, many generations. Like you said, the vision hasn't changed. It's simply been carried forward. So I really have to, just give thanks to both of you for making the time tonight, for the tireless work that you do, that you continue to do, the hours and hours of study and education that you have given to yourselves in order to talk about these things on such a high level, to make educated choices as leaders. And I think there is going to be always a lot of misconception out there for people who pick up the things that it's convenient to be upset or negative about, these small things along the way. And it's right, it's good that they have a voice and that they have concerns, and that we continue to try to get everyone on the same page. But I think for myself personally, it can be disheartening too, because the mistrust has been there a long, long time, like you said. But we do unfortunately have to wrap up our talk tonight. I would ask that, just anything final that you guys want to say, a sentence, a feeling, a hope, a goal for everybody out there listening. And then we're going to call it a night. But I just really wanted to express my thanks before we're offline. So
Well,
I'll give it over to you for just last comment.
I better say something quick, because I think Stephen should have the last word. But I was very honored to be invited to do this, just because to get a chance to be with my friend Stephen here, because we're connected somehow, and we'll always be connected. But what I wanted to just offer you is that, we do this work, and we have a series that we've developed that we can deliver via Zoom over a course of several weeks. And it'll lay out the same process that I was talking about in terms of those 5 pillars of the inherent right. And I could send you the outline of it, the scope and sequence of it. And if you want to do that, we could do it.
Definitely.
So I offer that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Herb, thank you so much, Herb, and we'll take you up on that offer. Let's do it. I agree with you. Let's do a series over Zoom. And I also think that a conference on self-government is in order here, to shake out the blanket, because the issue of trust is a big one that needs to be addressed.
Right.
Anyway, Herb, thank you so much. It's been enlightening. I feel energized just listening to you and talking with you. Thank you, Teresa and the outreach team.
Yep. Thank you.
Good evening. Good work, guys.
Thank you very, very much.
And let's recommit to Satsan's program from the Stalo Treaty Association, and we'll be in touch with you, Satsan.
Right on.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I
Okay.
really love this.